I am Evelyn Parker, 66 years old, a nurse for 30 years at Cleveland Hospital, where I cared for strangers with all my heart while my own home was slowly transforming into a prison of silence and humiliation. That Thanksgiving evening, as I placed the golden roasted turkey on the table, a dish I had woken at 5 in the morning to prepare, my daughter-in-law, Melissa, stood up, looked straight into my eyes with chilling contempt, then spat directly onto the food, her voice cold as ice. "This looks disgusting. You think we're going to eat this?" I stood frozen. My heart seemingly stopped beating, but what hurt more than anything was when I turned to my son, Daniel, the man I had sacrificed my entire youth to raise, and he simply kept his head down, continuing to push food around his plate as if nothing had happened. In that moment, I realized I had become invisible in the very house I had built. My hands trembled as I gripped the white porcelain bowl, the only remaining heirloom from my mother, and I slammed it hard against the tile floor, the shattering sound echoing through the silence like an alarm bell announcing an awakening. If you were me, would you choose to swallow your humiliation or stand up and reclaim your dignity? Stay with me, because I chose the second path, and what I did next will ensure they never dare disrespect a woman again. The crash of porcelain against tile still rang in my ears 3 days later as I sat in the cramped studio apartment I had rented on the east side of Cleveland, where the radiator clanked through the night and the smell of mildew clung to the faded yellow wallpaper. I had left Daniel's house that very night after the incident, walking out into the November cold with nothing but my purse, my nurse's scrubs still in the dryer, my reading glasses still on the nightstand beside the bed I had slept in for 23 years. The apartment was all I could afford on my fixed income, a meager pension from the hospital and social security checks that barely covered rent and groceries. I had given Daniel everything: the down payment on his first house, the tuition for his engineering degree, the car he drove to his first job interview. I had worked double shifts, skipped meals, worn the same winter coat for 15 years so he could have what he needed. And when Melissa came into his life 7 years ago, I had welcomed her with open arms, paid for their wedding flowers when their budget ran short, stayed up all night with their son Leo when he had colic so they could sleep. I had believed that sacrifice was love, that giving until you had nothing left was what mothers did. But sacrifice, I was learning, could be mistaken for weakness. Melissa had started small. At first, it was just little comments. "Evelyn, maybe you shouldn't wear that color. It washes you out," delivered with a smile that never reached her eyes. Then it was the way she rearranged my kitchen, moving the coffee mugs I had organized to the back of the cabinet, placing her expensive Italian espresso maker front and center. She redecorated the living room without asking, painting over the soft cream walls I loved with a harsh grey that made the space feel cold and institutional. When I mentioned that I missed the old colour, she laughed, a tinkling sound like breaking glass, and said, "Evelyn, it's time to modernize. You can't live in the past forever." Daniel said nothing. He never said anything. He would glance up from his phone, offer a weak smile, then retreat back into his screen, leaving me alone to navigate the minefield of his wife's passive aggression. The day I moved my belongings into the studio apartment, Daniel didn't help. He texted me, "Mum, Melissa thinks it's better if we give each other space. You understand, right?" I stared at those words for a long time, sitting on the edge of the bare mattress the landlord had left behind, the springs creaking beneath me. The window overlooked an alley where a dumpster overflowed with trash bags, and somewhere in the building, a baby cried endlessly, the sound seeping through the thin walls like water through cracked plaster. I understood, all right. I understood that I had raised a man who valued peace over principle. comfort over courage. I understood that I had given him so much that he had learned to take without ever learning to give back. That first week in the apartment was the loneliest of my life. I worked my shifts at the hospital, came home to silence, ate canned soup straight from the pot because I didn't have the energy to dirty a bowl. At the hospital, I cared for elderly patients who had no family, who lay in their beds waiting for visitors who never came, and I saw myself in their hollow eyes. I had spent 3 decades advocating for others, holding their hands as they took their last breaths, and now I wondered who would hold mine. One night, as I was leaving the hospital after a particularly brutal 12-hour shift, I ran into Dr. Helen Cortez, a colleague I had worked with for years. She took one look at me, at my rumpled scrubs, my unwashed hair, the dark circles under my eyes, and insisted on buying me coffee at the diner across the street. We sat in a corner booth, the vinyl seats cracked and patched with duct tape, the air thick with the smell of burnt coffee and bacon grease. Helen stirred her coffee slowly, the spoon clinking against the ceramic mug, and finally said, "Evelyn, you look like you're barely holding on." What happened? And so I told her. I told her about Thanksgiving, about the spit in the turkey, about Daniel's silence, about the studio apartment, and the loneliness that pressed against my chest like a weight I couldn't lift. Helen listened without interrupting, her dark eyes steady on mine, and when I finished, she reached across the table and took my hand. "You know," she said quietly, "my mother went through something similar with my brother. She gave him everything, and he treated her like she was invisible. It wasn't until she stopped giving that he realized what he had lost." She paused, then added, "Sometimes, Evelyn, the only way to teach people your value is to withdraw it entirely." Her words stayed with me as I walked back to my apartment that night, the streetlights casting long shadows on the empty sidewalks, the wind cutting through my thin jacket. I thought about all the years I had spent making myself smaller, quieter, more convenient. I thought about the times I had bitten my tongue when Melissa criticized me, the times I had apologized for things I hadn't done wrong, the times I had pretended not to notice when Daniel chose her side over mine. I thought about my mother, who had worked 2 jobs to raise me and my sister Beatrice after our father left, who had never complained, never asked for anything in return. My mother had died when I was 35, exhausted and worn down, and I had promised myself I would honor her sacrifice by being strong. But somewhere along the way, I had confused strength with silence. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning, slipped under my door by the mailman because the apartment had no mailbox. It was a thick, cream-colored envelope with my name written in elegant script, and when I opened it, a single sheet of paper fell out, along with a set of keys. The letter was from a law firm in Santa Fe, New Mexico, informing me that my sister Beatrice had passed away 3 weeks earlier from a sudden stroke. We hadn't spoken in over 10 years, a rift that had formed after a stupid argument I could barely remember now, something about money and boundaries and things that seemed so important at the time but felt utterly meaningless in the face of her death. The letter explained that Beatrice had left me her house, a 2-story adobe home with hardwood floors and a balcony overlooking the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, along with $52,000 in cash and a life insurance policy worth $85,000. I sat on the edge of my bed, holding the keys in my palm, and for the first time in months, I cried. Not out of grief, though I felt that too, a deep ache for the years we had lost, but out of something else, something that felt almost like relief. Beatrice, who had built a life on her own terms, who had never married or had children, who had traveled the world and written poetry and lived unapologetically, had given me a way out. She had given me a second chance. The next day, I called the law firm and arranged to fly to Santa Fe the following week. I didn't tell Daniel. I didn't tell anyone except Helen, who hugged me tightly in the hospital break room and whispered, "Go, Evelyn. Go and find yourself again." I packed a single suitcase, left the key to the studio apartment on the kitchen counter, and bought a one-way ticket. As the plane lifted off from Cleveland, I looked down at the city sprawled below, the grey streets, the industrial warehouses, the life I was leaving behind. And I felt something shift inside me, like a door opening after being locked for years. Santa Fe was nothing like Cleveland. The air was dry and clean, scented with pinon smoke and sage, and the sky stretched endlessly above, a brilliant cerulean blue that made my chest ache with its beauty. Beatrice's house sat at the end of a quiet street lined with cottonwood trees, their leaves golden in the late autumn sun. The front door was painted turquoise, a vibrant splash of color against the earth-toned adobe. And when I stepped inside, I was greeted by the smell of old books and lavender. The house was filled with her presence, bookshelves crammed with poetry collections, paintings she had done herself hanging on the walls, a worn leather armchair positioned by the window where she must have sat to read. On the dining table, I found a bottle of red wine and a handwritten note. "Evelyn, you deserve to live with dignity. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise. Love, B." I sat in that armchair and drank the wine straight from the bottle, watching the sun set over the mountains, the sky turning shades of pink and orange and gold that seemed impossible, like a painting too beautiful to be real. For the first time in months, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. I felt free. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the bedroom window, warm and golden, so different from the grey Cleveland mornings I had grown used to. I lay in Beatrice's bed, my bed now, and stared at the wooden beams crossing the ceiling, their surfaces smooth and worn with age. The house creaked gently as it settled, a comforting sound, like an old friend shifting in their chair. I thought about Daniel and Melissa, about the house in Cleveland that I had helped pay for, about the life I had built there, and the way it had been dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained but resentment and silence. And then I thought about the keys in my pocket, the bank account with more money than I had ever possessed in my life, and the realization that for the first time, I held all the cards. I spent the first week in Santa Fe settling into the house, exploring its rooms and corners, discovering the life Beatrice had lived. In her bedroom closet, I found journals dating back 30 years, filled with her neat handwriting, poems and observations and sketches of the mountains. One entry, dated 5 years before her death, caught my attention. "I've been thinking about Evelyn. I wonder if she's happy. I wonder if she ever escaped that prison of obligation she built around herself. I hope she knows she doesn't owe anyone her life." I traced the words with my fingertip, feeling the texture of the paper, and something hardened inside me. Not bitterness exactly, but clarity. Beatrice had understood what I was only now beginning to learn, that love without boundaries was not love at all, but servitude. I contacted the law firm handling Beatrice's estate and met with a lawyer named Marcus Chen, a soft-spoken man in his 40s with kind eyes and a firm handshake. We sat in his office overlooking the plaza, the walls lined with law books and Pueblo pottery, and he walked me through the details of the inheritance. The house was fully paid off, the property taxes minimal. The cash and life insurance combined totaled $137,000 after taxes and fees. "Ms. Parker," Marcus said, leaning forward in his chair, "this gives you options. Real options. What do you want to do with it?" I thought about his question for a long moment, watching tourists stroll through the plaza below, their cameras flashing as they photographed the palace of the governors. What did I want? For so long, I had defined myself by what others needed from me. Now, for the first time, I had the power to define myself. I want to go back to Cleveland, I said slowly, but not to stay. I want to reclaim what's mine. Marcus raised an eyebrow. Legally speaking, what exactly is yours? I explained the situation, how I had contributed significantly to the down payment on Daniel and Melissa's house, how I had paid for repairs and renovations over the years, how my name had once been on the deed as a co-owner before Daniel refinanced and removed me without telling me. Marcus listened carefully, taking notes, and when I finished, he sat back in his chair and tapped his pen against his notepad. If your name was on the original deed and you contributed financially, you may have a legal claim, he said. But even if you don't, there are other ways to assert your rights. Tell me, Miss Parker, what outcome do you want? Do you want the house back? Or do you want them to understand what they've lost? Both, I said, without hesitation. Over the next 2 weeks, Marcus and I built a case. We obtained copies of the original deed from the county recorder's office, documented my financial contributions with bank statements and cancelled checks I had kept in a box in my storage unit, and prepared a letter demanding restitution or legal action. But more than that, Marcus helped me understand that I didn't need to settle for scraps. I deserved acknowledgement, respect, and if they couldn't give it willingly, I would take it by force. While Marcus worked on the legal side, I focused on something else, rebuilding myself. I joined a yoga class at a community center near the plaza, where I met a group of women in their 60s and 70s who had also reinvented their lives after loss or betrayal. There was Patricia, a former teacher who had left her abusive husband at 62 and now ran a pottery studio. Gloria, a retired engineer who had started hiking the mountains after her children stopped calling. And Sandra, a widow who had turned her grief into activism, volunteering at a shelter for domestic violence survivors. These women became my tribe, my mirror, showing me that it was never too late to start over. One evening, after yoga class, we sat on the patio of a cafe near the plaza, drinking margaritas and watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky turning shades of purple and rose. Patricia leaned back in her chair, her silver hair glowing in the fading light, and said, "You know what I've learned, Evelyn? The people who take advantage of your kindness are the same ones who call you selfish the moment you stop giving." The others nodded in agreement, and Gloria added, "They never see you as a person. They see you as a resource. And when the resource runs dry, they act like you've betrayed them." Their words resonated deep in my chest, validating feelings I had been afraid to name. By the end of the month, Marcus had completed his work. He handed me a thick folder containing the legal documents, the letter of demand, and a timeline for action. "This is solid," he said, his voice confident. "If they refuse to negotiate, we can file a civil suit. But honestly, I think once they see this, they'll fold." I thanked him, paid his retainer from Beatrice's inheritance, and booked a flight back to Cleveland. I wasn't going back as the woman who had left, broken, humiliated, invisible. I was going back as someone new, someone who had learned that power came not from what you gave, but from what you refused to give away. The night before I left Santa Fe, I stood on the balcony of Beatrice's house, wrapped in a wool blanket against the cool November air, and looked up at the stars. They were so bright here, unobscured by city lights, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. I thought about my mother, about Beatrice, about all the women who had come before me and sacrificed their voices for the sake of peace. And I made a promise to them, and to myself, that I would not go quietly into the margins. I would speak. I would act. I would reclaim my dignity, no matter the cost. When I landed in Cleveland 2 days later, the city felt smaller than I remembered, the sky lower and greyer, pressing down like a lid. I rented a car and drove through the familiar streets, past the hospital where I had worked, past the grocery store where I used to shop, past the neighborhood where Daniel and Melissa lived. Their house looked the same from the outside, a tidy 2-story colonial with a manicured lawn and a wreath on the front door. But I knew what lay beneath that facade, the rot hidden behind fresh paint. I didn't go to the house immediately. Instead, I checked into a hotel downtown, a modest but clean place with a view of the Cuyahoga River. I laid the legal documents out on the desk, reviewed them one last time, and called Marcus to confirm everything was in order. "You're ready," he said. "Go get what's yours." I hung up, straightened my navy blue dress, the one I had bought in Santa Fe, tailored and elegant, nothing like the faded scrubs I used to wear, and drove to Daniel's house. It was a Saturday afternoon, and when I pulled into the driveway, I saw Melissa's car parked out front. Good. I wanted her to be there. I wanted them both to see me. I walked up the front path, my heels clicking against the concrete, and knocked on the door. It took a moment, but then Daniel answered, his face registering shock when he saw me. "Mom?" he said, his voice uncertain. "What are you doing here?" "Invite me in," I said calmly. "We need to talk." He hesitated, glancing back into the house, but I didn't wait for permission. I stepped past him into the foyer, the same foyer where I had once welcomed guests, hung Christmas stockings, swept away autumn leaves tracked in on shoes. Melissa appeared from the kitchen, wiping her hands on a towel, her expression shifting from surprise to irritation. "Evelyn," she said flatly, "this isn't a good time." "Make time," I replied, my voice steady and cold. I walked into the living room and set my purse on the coffee table, then pulled out the folder Marcus had prepared. I placed it on the table between us, letting the weight of it speak before I did. Daniel and Melissa exchanged a glance, and I could see the first flicker of fear in their eyes. "What is this?" Daniel asked. "This," I said, "is a legal demand for restitution. I contributed over $40,000 to the down payment on this house, and I have the documentation to prove it. My name was on the original deed before you refinanced without my knowledge. According to my lawyer, I have a legitimate claim to a significant portion of the equity in this property." The room went silent. Melissa's face flushed red, and Daniel's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. "Mum, that was years ago," he finally stammered. "You said it was a gift." "I said it was a contribution," I corrected. "A contribution to a family home where I was supposed to be welcome. But you made it very clear that I'm not welcome here anymore." I paused, letting my words sink in. "So now, you have two options. You can negotiate a fair settlement with me, compensating me for my financial contributions and the years of unpaid labor I provided, cooking, cleaning, childcare. Or we can go to court, and a judge will decide." Melissa stepped forward, her voice sharp. "This is ridiculous. You're just bitter because we asked you to move out." I turned to her, my gaze unwavering. "You didn't ask, Melissa. You told me I was a burden. You spat on the food I prepared. You erased me from my own home." I looked back at Daniel. "And you let her. You stood by and said nothing." Daniel's eyes filled with tears, but I felt no sympathy. "Mum, I'm sorry," he whispered. "I didn't know how to. You didn't know how to choose your mother over your wife's cruelty." I finished for him. "That's not a choice, Daniel. That's cowardice." I picked up my purse and turned toward the door. "You have 30 days to respond to the demand letter. After that, my lawyer will file a lawsuit. Think carefully about what you want to do." I paused at the threshold and looked back one last time. "I raised you to be better than this, Daniel. I hope you figure out what that means before it's too late." And then I walked out, leaving them standing in the wreckage of their assumptions. The confrontation at the house had left me shaking, not with fear, but with adrenaline, the kind that courses through your veins when you finally stop running and turn to face your pursuer. I drove back to the hotel, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, and when I reached my room, I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling as my heart gradually slowed. I had done it. I had stood up to them, and the look on their faces, shock, fear, the dawning realization that I was no longer the woman they could dismiss, was worth every moment of doubt and anxiety leading up to this. The next week unfolded like a slow-motion avalanche. Daniel called me repeatedly, his voicemails a mixture of apologies and desperate pleas. "Mum, please, can we just talk? We don't need lawyers. We can work this out." But I didn't answer. I had said everything I needed to say, and now it was time for them to respond with actions, not words. Melissa, on the other hand, went on the offensive. She posted on social media about toxic family members and ungrateful parents, thinly veiled references that her friends surely understood. But I didn't care. Her opinion of me had never mattered, and now, finally, I was free of the burden of trying to win her approval. On day 8, I received a call from Marcus. "They've responded," he said, his voice tinged with satisfaction. "They're willing to negotiate." We scheduled a meeting at a neutral location, a conference room in a downtown law office, for the following Monday. Marcus advised me to stay calm, to let him do most of the talking, but I knew that this meeting was about more than money. It was about being seen, being heard, and being taken seriously. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully in a charcoal grey suit I had bought in Santa Fe, paired with a silk blouse the colour of deep burgundy. I applied lipstick, something I rarely wore, and looked at myself in the hotel mirror. The woman staring back at me was someone I barely recognized, confident, composed, unbreakable. I thought of Beatrice's note, "You deserve to live with dignity," and I felt her presence beside me, a hand on my shoulder, urging me forward. When I arrived at the law office, Marcus was already there, reviewing documents at a polished mahogany table. Daniel and Melissa sat across from him, flanked by their own lawyer, a severe-looking woman in her 50s with sharp eyes and a tight bun. The tension in the room was palpable, thick enough to cut with a knife. I took my seat beside Marcus, folded my hands on the table, and waited. Their lawyer spoke first. "Ms. Parker, my clients are willing to offer you a settlement of $15,000, which we believe is more than fair given the circumstances." She slid a document across the table. "This would include a full release of any claims against the property." I glanced at the document but didn't touch it. 15,000, I repeated slowly. "For 40,000 in contributions plus years of unpaid labor." "The contributions were gifts," the lawyer countered, "and the labor was voluntary." I leaned forward, my voice calm but laced with steel. "The contributions were made with the understanding that I would remain part of the household. The labor was performed because I believed I was building a family, not serving as unpaid help." I looked at Daniel, who couldn't meet my eyes. Tell me, Daniel, did you ever once consider what it cost me to support you? The shifts I worked, the meals I skipped, the dreams I deferred? He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Melissa, however, had plenty to say. "This is extortion," she hissed. "You're trying to manipulate us into giving you money you don't deserve." I turned to her slowly, my expression unreadable. "Melissa, I'm done being manipulated by you. You spent years making me feel small, unwanted, invisible. You treated me like I was an inconvenience in a house I helped buy. And you," I looked back at Daniel, "you let her. So no, this isn't extortion. This is accountability." Marcus interjected, his tone professional but firm. "My client's claim is legitimate and well documented. If this matter goes to court, we're confident a judge will rule in her favor, and the settlement amount will likely be much higher once legal fees and damages are factored in." He paused. "However, Ms. Parker is willing to accept $60,000 as a full settlement, along with a written acknowledgement of her contributions to the household." Their lawyer conferred with Daniel and Melissa in hushed tones. I watched them, these two people who had once been my family, and felt nothing but a strange, hollow detachment. Finally, their lawyer nodded. "We'll need time to review our options." "You have 72 hours," Marcus said. "After that, we file the lawsuit." We left the conference room, and as we walked out into the cold Cleveland afternoon, Marcus turned to me with a small smile. "You did great in there," he said. "You didn't flinch." "I've done enough flinching," I replied. 3 days later, they agreed to the settlement, $60,000, plus a letter, written by Daniel himself, acknowledging my financial and emotional contributions to the family. The money was transferred into my account, and when I received the notification on my phone, I felt a weight lift that I hadn't even realized I was carrying. But it wasn't the money that mattered most. It was the letter. I read it alone in my hotel room, the paper trembling slightly in my hands. Daniel's handwriting was messy, the letters slanted and uneven, as if each word had been dragged out of him against his will. "Mum, I know I failed you. I should have stood up for you. I should have protected you. I'm sorry for the pain I caused, and I'm sorry it took losing you to realize what you meant to me." There was more, but I didn't need to read it all. The acknowledgement was enough. Before I left Cleveland for good, there was one more thing I needed to do. I drove to the elementary school where my grandson Leo was a student and waited outside at dismissal time. When he came out, his backpack bouncing on his small shoulders, his face lit up when he saw me. "Grandma!" he shouted, running toward me. I caught him in my arms, holding him tightly, breathing in the scent of his hair, a mixture of playground dirt and grape juice. "Hey, buddy," I said, kneeling down so we were eye to eye. "I wanted to see you before I left." His smile faltered. "You're leaving?" "I am," I said gently. "But that doesn't mean I'm gone. I'm going to live in a new place, somewhere beautiful, and you can come visit me whenever you want. Your dad has my number." "Why can't you stay here?" he asked, his voice small. I thought carefully about how to answer. "Sometimes grown-ups make mistakes," I said, "and sometimes the best thing we can do is start over somewhere new. But I'll always love you, Leo. Always." He hugged me tightly, and I felt tears prick my eyes. Whatever had happened between Daniel and me, Leo was innocent. He deserved to know he was loved, and I would make sure he never forgot. The next day, I boarded a plane back to Santa Fe, watching Cleveland disappear beneath the clouds. As the plane climbed higher, I thought about everything that had happened. The betrayal, the confrontation, the settlement. I thought about Beatrice and my mother, about all the women who had taught me, through their lives and their deaths, that dignity was not given, but claimed. And I realized that I had spent so long defining myself by my relationships, as a mother, a nurse, a caregiver, that I had forgotten who I was underneath all those roles. Now, finally, I was beginning to remember. Back in Santa Fe, I threw myself into rebuilding my life. I enrolled in a watercolor painting class at the community center, something I had always wanted to try but never had time for. I joined a book club that met at a local cafe where we discussed everything from contemporary fiction to memoirs by women who had defied expectations. I volunteered at a women's shelter, using my nursing skills to help survivors of domestic violence. And in their stories, I saw echoes of my own, different circumstances, but the same themes of control, erasure, and eventual escape. One afternoon, as I was setting up for a yoga class on the patio of my house, Patricia stopped by with a bottle of wine. We sat on the balcony, watching the mountains turn pink in the fading light, and she asked me how I was feeling. Honestly, I said, I feel free. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm living for me. Patricia smiled. Good. You deserve that. She poured us each a glass of wine, and we toasted to new beginnings. A few months later, I received a phone call from Daniel. He asked if he and Leo could come visit during spring break. I hesitated, unsure if I was ready to let them back into my life. But then I thought of Leo's small face, his innocent question, "Why can't you stay here?" And I agreed. When they arrived, Daniel stood on my doorstep looking older, thinner, the weight of his mistakes etched into the lines around his eyes. "Mom," he said quietly, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I want to try to make things right." I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I invited them in, poured lemonade for Leo, and sat across from Daniel at the dining table. "Forgiveness isn't something you earn in a single visit," I told him. "It's something you build over time, through actions, not words. If you're serious about making things right, you'll show me. You'll teach Leo what respect looks like. You'll never let anyone treat him, or anyone else, the way you let Melissa treat me." He nodded, tears streaming down his face. "I will. I promise." Over the course of that week, we began the slow, painful process of rebuilding our relationship. Leo loved the house, running through the rooms and exploring the backyard, and I taught him how to mix watercolors, how to paint the mountains he could see from the balcony. Daniel and I talked, really talked, for the first time in years. He told me about his marriage, how Melissa had left him after the settlement, unable to handle the financial strain and the shame of what had happened. He was living in a smaller apartment now, working long hours to make ends meet, and he admitted that he had taken me for granted, that he had been too afraid of conflict to stand up for what was right. I listened, and slowly, I began to understand that he was not beyond redemption. He was flawed, human, and broken in ways I was only beginning to see. But he was also trying, and that mattered. On their last day in Santa Fe, we hiked up to a viewpoint overlooking the valley. Leo ran ahead, chasing lizards and collecting smooth stones, while Daniel and I walked side by side in comfortable silence. At the top, we stood together, looking out at the endless expanse of sky and earth. And Daniel turned to me. "Mum, I know I can't undo what I did. But I want you to know that I see you now. I see everything you gave. And I'm sorry it took me so long." I placed my hand on his shoulder. "I'm not asking you to undo the past, Daniel. I'm asking you to do better in the future." He nodded, and we stood there together, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the sky turning shades of orange and gold and purple. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: hope. As I sit on my balcony now, a cup of chamomile tea warming my hands, I think about the journey that brought me here. I think about the woman I was, silent, self-sacrificing, invisible, and the woman I have become. I think about Beatrice, whose death gave me a second chance at life, and my mother, whose memory reminds me that strength is not always loud. Sometimes it is quiet, persistent, unyielding. I have learned that forgiveness is not the same as forgetting, that love without boundaries is not love at all, and that standing up for yourself is not selfish, it is survival. I have learned that you teach people how to treat you, and that silence, while sometimes necessary, can also be complicity. To anyone reading this, anyone who has ever been made to feel small or invisible or unworthy, you are not alone. You are not too old, too tired, or too broken to reclaim your life. It is never too late to stand up, to speak out, to choose yourself. Your dignity is not something others can give you. It is something you claim, fiercely and without apology. So I ask you, will you choose to stay silent, or will you choose to stand? Will you allow yourself to be erased, or will you write your own story? Share this if it resonated with you. Subscribe to hear more stories of resilience, redemption, and reclaiming power, because we all deserve to live with dignity. And sometimes the most revolutionary act is simply refusing to disappear.